So I guess we can start with what you have on the Lightner brothers. Did you talk to
Yep.
them?
No, they sent a new proposal,
Okay.
and I think I had intended to send it to you, and then clearly I didn't. But I've got it pulled up, and I can read through. I mean, the money is still the same. They just shuffled it around. So let me pull that up. So, for those of you watching this later, this is the February 3rd, 2021 meeting of the RHDC Research Committee. And okay, so shoot, sorry, my windows aren't moving where I can read them. The proposal for the Lightner brothers, so they broke it up into a preliminary letter and full study. So their revised proposal is to do it in two parts. The first being a preliminary letter. Okay, I just said that. Let me scroll down. Okay, the preliminary letter would highlight the Lightner brothers' prolific careers, African-American architects and builders in Raleigh, and provide an assessment of their significance to Raleigh's African-American history and the importance of their two extant buildings in Raleigh, Davie Street Presbyterian Church and the Lightner Funeral Home. It will, the evaluation letter will give y'all, the research committee, the information you need to decide to proceed with the full study. Once that's submitted, they'll wait to hear from you to go with the full study. And then the full study would chronicle the Lightner brothers' lives, document all buildings they built, include photographs and illustrated maps were available, and then make recommendations to you for the potential, I guess, for other extant buildings to be designated as local landmarks or listed in the National Register of Historic Places. And then it'll include a table that lists all the buildings that were built in Raleigh, their status. So there'd be 4 deliverables: the preliminary letter, the study, you get all digital photographs, and then the GIS data. So they're proposing that first piece of it would be 1,900, with the the rest of it being an additional 3,000 for a total of the cost being 4,900, inclusive of all expenses. So that is what we have.
How does this tie into the second item on the agenda?
Not a lot.
Okay.
I mean, it could, but they're not directly related.
Is there any way we could?
Yeah.
I mean, to lump them together. I mean.
Not.
This is specifically Lightner brothers.
This is specifically Lightner brothers. Let me tell you what. Let me, if you don't mind, if you want to sort of table this for a moment, I can tell you about the conversation I had with the State Historic Preservation Office.
Okay.
I met a few weeks ago. I met with the SHPO person. Now I'm blanking on her name. Beth, who is over National Register designations in our area, and also with Michelle, who is this over all the grants in the State Historic Preservation Office. So I met with the two of them to talk about the idea of doing an architectural inventory focusing on African American history here in Raleigh, because we haven't done anything like that since the late 80s is when the survey was done. And then we did Culture Town, and then over the years there were some landmark designations. And then when we did the architectural survey for the 1945 to 55 1945 to 65 time frame, we did identify some neighborhoods that were then listed in the National Register, and that included Rochester Heights, Battery Heights, Madonna Acres. I feel like I might be forgetting one, but at least those three. And so her guidance was for us to, we need to develop a scope of what we're going to do. And it was, and her guidance is to sort of, target what you want to look at. And so my thought in speaking with her, and she seemed to be a good idea, was that we could look at a time frame starting in around 1938, which is where the last survey ended. So it would cover a little bit of civil rights history and sort of everything coming in that era, and identify additional resources, maybe some neighborhoods, but probably individual properties that are significant from that time period, regardless of when they were built. They sent a few examples of, and that would, depending on, I was trying to get an idea of how much it would cost before, sending out an RFP. And it was very, dependent on what our scope is. The two examples that they gave of recent, studies that used grant funds. One was, sorry, I'm looking for my notes here. One was in Transylvania County. And I want to say the other was Greensboro. Oh, there it is. Yeah. And the other was, so Greensboro for another thing. Oh, helps if I look on the right date. I met with them. I was trying to find them in my notes on the 11th, and I met with them on the 12th. So yeah, Transylvania County and Greensboro being the most recent. The Greensboro study was around $22,000, with 40% of that coming from the city and 60% coming from the grant program. That's the and then the Transylvania County was 15,000 total. So it's a bigger project, and then they always are. So the question I have so what typically happens, so the idea behind the architectural survey and focused ones is to identify, tell the story, write the story. We can do oral histories if that is appropriate, and it might be. We can incorporate that. That is what Transylvania did. But we can also, shoot, that's my train of thought. Oh, the point of it is to, write the history, develop a context, and then identify, properties that we know of now, but then also write in sort of, potentially sort of criteria of, if you find another property that we don't know about later down the line, these are the kinds of things that potentially would make it significant under this area, with the idea of specifically looking at places, sites, objects, areas that are eligible for listing in the National Register, which then would also be local, eligible for a local landmark designation. But that's the focus. And then those properties that are identified during the study get placed on the state study list, which is the first list actually being the first step in getting listed in the National Register. So does that seem, the grant deadline is coming up. We have till April for that, and then it would be a really quick turnaround, because even though the deadline is in April for the grant, the work would still have to be done at the end of August, because it would still have to be in during this federal fiscal year. So project done in August so that they can wrap up all their paperwork by the end of September. So my question to you, is that something you still want to pursue? Does that seem like a good way to focus on it, instead of looking, to redoing anything that has already been done, but to sort of focus on the next part of history? We could focus it even tighter if you want. I'm seeking feedback and gauging interest. And once I have that, then I can write up a scope for you to review before I send it out. Now I'm stopping talking.
What years did you say this was? You said 1938 to when?
Typically for National Register, it'd be 50 years
Okay.
from, 50 years from now. So, or prior to now.
38 to 71.
Yes.
So I have a question, and this might just be because I'm not familiar with all of what we're doing in the Listener House. To identify that they're going to summarize the properties, identify them, write them up for us, give us the scope of why their historic value is to Raleigh as African-American architects. Am I hearing correctly?
Well, they're builders, and maybe some design. I mean, that looking at, architects and designers would be another way to do a broader study, and not focus just on it.
Because it seems to me, and we run into this all the time when properties, come before RHDC, whether or not they should be certified or, get state certification, or, torn down, or what's the basis of them. But there is no collective. I'm sorry, I have a new puppy and she's whining.
Okay.
Anyway, it seems to me that in the back, idea is to have a collective resource that says, here's what's important in our community. Here's what the contribution of the African-American community was to Raleigh. And I would think it's not just limited to builders. I would think it would be, the overall contributions, because if it were an architecturally important structure, we would want to preserve that, wouldn't we?
So I think
I'm struggling. 5,000 for this, 22,000 for this. Shouldn't we be looking more holistically at this rather than kind of, here's a piece of it, and who's going to look at it? It'd be great to go to a book that says, here's the documentation of the African-American value to this community, and maybe get a grant to help us do that.
So yes and no. It depends on a number of things. So we're talking about, we are talking about two separate things at the moment, and you can decide not to look just at the Lightners. You can say, let's not do that. Let's look broadly. So that's less about, back that. So when it comes to doing, identification of historic resources and the stories related to them, that is one of the commission's primary goal. It's always done in steps. We are never going to have this holistic picture of what is of value for anything, because we're constantly researching, we're constantly learning more as time passes. Other things become older, and we learn about their value. So it's always making strategic decisions about what you want to focus on now. So what I have been talking about was sort of our basic architectural inventory, and a basic architectural inventory study, which would not, which the focus would be on a time frame and African Americans, but not necessarily not necessarily, focusing on things that were built by African Americans. It could be, buildings and sites that are important because, the building may have been built, in the 1800s, but it's significant in 1945 because this really important thing, happened then. That's one way. You could choose for this next architectural inventory to take this idea that's been brought forward, from the Leitner study and say, hey, we like this idea, but we don't want to focus just on them. Let's have our architectural inventory. Sorry, not inventory, survey. Architectural surveys focus on architects and builders that are African American in Raleigh. I mean, we have done thematic studies like that. We've got one that looks at, architects and designers that came out of the NC State Design, architecture design school. We've got a context on the work of Dietrich, I think, and we've got some that are from time frames. And each of these individual surveys and studies we pull out the buildings and sites and places we find and we put them in the inventory, but we still have the studies that go along with it. So I was talking about, two things that could be related, but not necessarily. A proposal to just look at the Leitner brothers, and then a potential grant-funded project to look at, African-American history in Raleigh, at least, from 1938 till 71 broadly, or more focused. Because I think Verche had mentioned at one point, one of the meetings she was in, an interest in looking at architects and designers. So, you get to choose the scope.
I really appreciate that history because it helps me, and I'm sure other people aren't as familiar as you are. So I love that you said there is an opportunity to do something that relates to architectural and builders in one research project. And I think that I'm just add a level of, the temperature that I have been sensing in our community. There's a more substantial commitment and significance to honoring and respecting African-American contributions to our country and certainly to our individual city. So I think if we were looking at any time where there's a moment where you could say, this is really an important thing to do, because, I think that Raleigh has many of these amazing, and, I'm sure other southern cities have the same thing, but every time I go somewhere, someone is telling me, oh, well, this used to be in, Freeman Village, and this used to be this, and there's no indication of it as a human walking around our city. It's not none, but there's limited indication of it. It would be, I think, important for us as a committee that's preserving history to know and document at a base level what exists, what we're aware of. That doesn't mean we don't add to it over time, but it seems like we're always kind of looking for what it is and where it is and why it is. And
yeah, and we're going to be.
It can't be combined and write a grant that actually suggests we do this work, because their work is certainly important. But it would include builders and architects. It would honor the African-American contribution to our city on that basis. So anyway, I just think if there ever was going to be a moment, this would be that moment.
Well, I agree. I mean, we're talking about doing and, updating the architectural inventory by focusing on African, American history, and you can choose what focus you want to take, what lens you want to use. Is it going to be architects and builders? What popped in my mind while you were talking is that if we were looking at architects and builders, that might actually, I think, to be thorough, you might actually have to go sort of back in time again and have a broader time frame if you're having a tighter focus, because you're going to be looking at things that potentially may have been slave built or freedman built. And some of it will be duplicative, like, oh, we already know this about Oberlin Village, we can pop that information in, and then we can learn, more. Or you can take the tack of, let's look at this time frame, these events that happened, and go from that direction. There's not a wrong answer. You just have to decide what you want to focus on and where you're going to spend your dollars, and you get dollars every year. So, and that's, and, depending on how complicated and what happens, in the world, you potentially, you're not going to get a grant every year, but you can do projects every year, every couple of years.
When do we need to decide this today, or?
No, because the deadline, fortunately, no, because the grant deadline is not till April. It would be helpful for me to have some idea of what you're interested in. I can go back, let me write down. If you are interested in thinking about looking at the architects and, builders from that angle, I would want to go back to the state and find out if anything like that has been done. Just, it helps to have a model. If not, we'll just make it up. But no, you do not have to decide today.
I'm going to throw another monkey wrench into it. So historically, and you're much more an expert on this than I am, but I have applied for grants that go over sequential years. So I'm thinking, like, if we had to do the research now and from April to August, which I agree is a very short time frame to do thorough investigation, we could just put a portion of it into this year and a portion of the thorough documentation into next year. We'd have a grant that we applied for that spanned 2 years. And I'm wondering if there's an example of that, maybe not by us, but I think there are examples of that being done in the world. Yes, you have to spend it by X time, but this part's being spent now, and the of it will be spent next year, and it's approved on a basis.
So for the grant funds we're talking about, it doesn't work that way. It's a 1-year project. Funds are allocated annually. So there are other grants out there, but the ones that we're talking about using are the Historic Preservation Fund grants that come from the National Park Service and are administered through the state historic preservation offices. Each state is allocated a certain amount of money annually. It gets during the federal budget cycle, and then they have this grant process. So it's a federal grant administered by the state, and they are, one-off 1-year projects. Now we could scope it to be we know we're going to do phase 1 to just look at this. We know we're going to do another one later, but for the particular grant cycle, you scope it, you do it, and then the next phase would be our choice to apply for another grant or to do it without grant funds. But they're not, we're not going to get more money and have a 2-year grant through that.
Because it seems to me this won't be completed from April till August.
Well, so the way these studies are generally done is phase inventory, or excuse me, I keep using inventory instead of survey, to do the survey, have a context, identify, properties, just as generally through, windshield survey, meaning sort of driving around, getting photos from the street. And then, you've identified them. Then the next step, and then things are put on the state study list. The next step then is to actually fund National Register nominations and get them listed in the National Register of Historic Places. And then also,
Okay, I'm going to complicate it one more step so you can tell me again I'm crazy. I love that you do this. You're so patient with me. We on the last on the call, the meeting that we had where we were doing the pretend offsite, which I thought was really valuable. One of the biggest issues was getting the RHDC known. Get awareness out there, and how do we do it? And to me, this is a phenomenal example of maybe citizen surveys. Like, we empower the citizens of our city to help us, not, apply for the grant, get the money, do it all. But as an organization, we view this as a way to engage our city and understanding and respecting what the African American community brought to Raleigh. And it's a phenomenal historic opportunity as well as an awareness opportunity for the RHDC and for our commitment to being equal and fair to all citizens of our city. And I think if we write it up as an idea, and I come from the business side, so write it up as a concept and put it out there with, here are the prongs of the concept. Part of it is the grant, part of it is this citizen survey committee, part of it is this piece, and I don't want to pretend that I know all the pieces yet, because I'm just listening to you and determining that there might be an opportunity to make this a real signature point of this committee and HDC in general. And so, yes, we need to improve the website, and yes, we need to do whatever the video tours were, whatever that is. But to me, this is a bigger concept of not only building on what's important to do, which is the architectural and builder survey, but to also build on the concept that the RHDC needs to have recognition and a vision in our community. And I think this concept actually could solve several things that seems to me the RHDC is concerned about. And we're thinking more globally. So if we're going to spend $22,000 or $25,000, to the city, that's nothing. That's an accounting error. To us, it's a lot. So if we're going to do it, how do we achieve the most for our dollars? And that's what I would like to see us do, and get the benefit, the overflow of the benefit to the entire goal of what the RHDC is trying to commit to.
Maybe what I can do, so the very first survey that was done back in the 80s that culminated, in Culture Town, was part of a much larger multi-year project that even wasn't entirely focusing on African American history. That was just one piece of it. And it came out of something called the Raleigh Roots Project. Why don't it sounds like what you're talking about is, similar to that. Perhaps what I can do is next month bring, more information about that and how that came together. Because I do believe that oral history is the way to go. We're not currently, I think the idea of citizen surveys is something that the preservation community has been talking about for years. Some communities have done it very successfully, others not so much. It will also depend on whether or not we're using grant funds or not, because the National Register tends to be more academic.
Oral histories can be instead of technical surveys, and oral history is
right, and it ties together. So yeah. we can do that.
And I will just volunteer to do whatever part. I actually have. I know everybody else is pretty consumed, but my commitment is to help us do this, and I have time. So I'm glad to step up and do whatever. Whatever requires, writing it up as a whatever you determine that needs labor. I know your staff is swamped, so I'm glad to take on those kinds of things.
Sure. All right. So I'm writing down what I said I was going to bring back. So I'd like to hear from others to what are your responses to Susan? Everybody's taking notes.
I was just going to suggest, after listening to Susan's concern, she may have been a bit confused as I was that we had actually talked about two separate things this morning. We switched from the Leitner brothers to the African context study, and that switch was pretty abrupt. It was not really outlined, so I'm not sure if she knew that we were talking about two separate things. The first thing you talked about, the Leitner brothers, and the second thing, which is a larger African American context or inventory, I think is what we've been talking about. Second, very important topic, but we should be careful not to reinvent the wheel. Like me, Susan and others may not be entirely aware of what has already been done on this topic. And it might be worth all our whiles to the link to, the, for instance, Method, what's been done at Method, what's been done at Oberlin, the Culture Town, which I've heard of, but I've never seen. I hear that's a great resource. I believe Culture Town is a book, right? Yeah, so Culture Town, and then I'm not sure if the previous architectural inventories that we've done for Raleigh, I can't remember when it was, but maybe that also had an African American section as well. So I just think that a good familiarity with what's already been done would streamline the process. So
yeah, I did a quick and dirty PowerPoint a few months ago, but I can write it down and we can do it again, and I can be more consolidated. The other thing that I just remembered is a conversation with Ernie Dollar at the City of Raleigh Museum to see what research, if anything, that they had done on the civil rights era or segregation, Jim Crow era, all of that here, segregation here in Raleigh. And they had an exhibit for a while, but nothing more than that. But his question was, would the RHDC ever be interested in republishing Culture Town? My response was twofold. One, there's some logistical details in that we donated the plates to the state archives, so we don't own them anymore. So that would be one thing. And the other thing is, if you did choose to do that, there would need to be a preamble, to sort of bring us, to tie it into what's going on now, and also say, this is what we knew in, 1988 or whenever, or 93 or whenever it was published. So I'm not suggesting we do that now, but I wanted to mention that before I forgot. But I saw heads nodding. It sounds like what I need to do for next month is specifically, again, talk about what research we've already done on African American history, but more specifically tie it to what it was. Like Method was one of these discrete historic contexts that focused on a very small area, identified, and was a low cost project. Oberlin Village we studied a couple different times and ended up with different results. One, it was looking at landmarks, one, within the recent historic overlay district. And then so I can do that if that will be helpful to make your decision. I can also make sure I can tell you let you know if anybody else has looked at African American architects and builders elsewhere in the state. We
It kind
also
of feels like we
share,
might be duplicating efforts a little bit with the Lightner brothers and this, and I'm wondering if anybody else is thinking that, and what, and I don't know. Am I off base in thinking that? I don't know.
I think they're a prominent family, particularly associated with the built environment in Raleigh, and what's left of those buildings are significant. But I do think that that could be tied in to a larger citywide survey. And Tanya, I wanted to add that maybe we could share what Greensboro has created in terms of their framework for their most recent survey. I was just looking through it, and you know, to say 1938 to 1971, Raleigh city limits, anything significant African American resource, that is a lot to send somebody out to do. So.
well, but that's what they're trained to do. That is what the architectural historians we would hire to do that. That's what they do. So yeah, I've got copies of the studies for both of those, Transylvania County and Greensboro, as well as their scopes of work to do it. So I do have that information that I can bring next time.
I think that would help a lot in sort of focusing this, because it seems pretty unfocused right now, and I'm having a hard time thinking of where this should go without, you know.
I agree, thanks. I feel like you've given us some great pieces, and I don't think they're really disparate. I think there's a connection between the architectural and the builder components, and I think we should look at it. I think it behooves us and the way we're going to spend our money to look at it a little more globally. That doesn't mean we're not going to go ahead with the Lichtner project, but I think we should do it with a little bit more understanding of what a global view is and how that could benefit us. If it costs a little bit more to get a more comprehensive piece, I think we have a benchmark to start from. So I agree with you, and if you could do that, Tanya, that'd be great. And Colette, thank you.
And just to throw this out there, it does look like Greensboro had a phased approach to trying to update their architectural survey. So, you know, we could specify where we want to start for a grant this year and then come back in 4 or 5 years and try to do the second half of it or something like that. If we I don't know how perceptive or how receptive the state would be to awarding City of Raleigh grant funds that close together. But
well, we used to get it every 2 years. We never applied we never applied every year because we know we have a lot more money than a lot of other communities, and our projects have ranged from, you know, larger to smaller. We've used HPF funds to do the design guidelines update. We've used them for architectural surveys. Some years we've done architectural surveys without funds, without grant funds, or with, you know, supplemental. A lot of times we would, you know, we'd pay 60% and only ask for 40%, you know, with the understanding that we are, you know, we do have more funds than a lot of other communities, and you do have staff. So the architectural keeping the architectural inventory update is a phased project. We need to be doing something at least every 5 years. More is better. But what I'm hearing from you is that we may want to look at a bigger picture project similar to what was done in the late 80s, where we're more specific and more targeted with how we interact with the community as well. So
I like the idea of republishing Culture Town. I don't know what the reality of that would look like with the plates and everything. I know we have. I mean, I held the plates physically yesterday. Like our annual inventory, so I know we have them. But I don't know. I guess we would just loan them out, but I don't know how that would work. But I like the idea.
Oh, do
And
you know
update,
who?
you know.
Yeah. Do you know who we would ask? Who I should reach out to ask? Like I've got the acknowledgement letter from when they were donated, but
The head of special collections, I can send you his email address.
okay, please do that, and we can at least, you know,
See where
ask.
that goes. Yeah. Okay. Shall we move on? Can you give me a little bit more background on this name change thing?
There's, you know what? Okay, I'll just keep talking. The email came to us. I don't have a lot of information. We received an email, today's Wednesday, Monday, from an attorney that has been hired for Shaw University. They own the building. The board of Shaw has voted to remove the Daniels name, you know, from the house in how they reference it. So they're going to refer to it as the Pegues House. It is listed in the National Register, and it is, you know, a Raleigh historic landmark. Their request was, how can we change the name on the plaque? I mean, that was where it came from. Now, from a National Register standpoint, National Register plaques are purchased by property owners. There's no formal arrangement with the National Park Service or the National Register. So they've got one plaque that simply is a basic, this is listed in the National Register. There's another plaque with the names. They could just move the National Register, you know, that plaque with the names and be done with it. The Raleigh Historic Landmark plaque is actually officially part of the designation process. It is purchased by the city. And so in order to get a new plaque with the name would need, the landmark designation would need to change. And that is what we just went through with the Haywood House, going from the Dr. Hubert Benbury Haywood House to the Marguerite and whatever, Haywood House, the new name. And so they will get a new plaque with the new name. What the question I have for you is do you have any appetite for that? I think that a study that we would need to do a little bit of research to determine what, I mean, maybe not. I mean, are you okay? Let me back up. So we would have to go through the same public process as, you know, adding a designation, removing the name, you know, would end up at city council. It is, I think, and I haven't read the report in some time, so I'm not sure, you know, it's got 4 names right now. I don't know if any one of them has, you know, was in the property longer, you know, where the significance lies. I think that this would be a good one for RHDC to sponsor. Should some additional research need to be done?
So they want to take off Bagley and Rogers as well.
Well, that's what they have said. So what I asked, so she said they voted to remove the Daniels name. And I replied, did they have, you know, does the board have a name in mind? And her response was, well, they're going to call it the Pegues House. I think, depending on the history of the other families, they may have an appetite for it having all the names as long as Daniels is left out. It may be simpler to just have it be the Pegues House because that's the last family that was there. I don't know enough about the history to say one way or the other. So I just brought that forward as a potential request and wanted to know how much effort you wanted staff to put into looking at that.
Well, the Rogers and Bagley family's history isn't exactly rosy either. less. I mean, the Daniels history is obviously the one that stands out, but and my feeling is if they're going to take the name Daniels off, they might as well take it all off. And if they're taking all of those names off, that does sort of raise my eyebrows a little bit. But at the same time, you know, it does make sense to name it after the last occupant of the house. So
Refresh my memory about how the Haywood house name changed. That's Jimmy Team's house, right, Tanya?
Correct. He found out over the last couple of years, he was able to meet with the children, or I guess it was the grandchildren. Anyway, he learned through family history that the mother, Marguerite, had been influential in the design of the house. And when his house had originally been designated, it was back in the day of you just named houses after the man. So, you know, the Fred Jones house or whatever it was. You know, now we include both names typically. And so that's where that came from. And because he wanted her name put in. So, and that just happened. The final vote was yesterday. So it is now officially named.
Yeah, it seems like he just, I'm not sure what else he did, but all I remember seeing was he had wrote a letter.
He just wrote a letter and had the history. It was a pretty basic, easy thing to do.
Isn't Shaw University, before they voted to change the name, they must have done some of the research to say, we don't want Daniels, but we're going to call it this because of this reason. I mean, I'm sure that the board didn't just go, okay, let's get rid of Daniels. So I think maybe we could ask them to do the same thing, Caleb, like ask them what their reasons were for changing the name. Could they write it up? And then all we are going to be responsible for doing is the same process we were for I forgot the name of the other house, and just be able to give the documentation on, you know, to city council and say, this is why the name's being changed. So we don't have to do the research. It may already be done. I think it'd be worth asking them. If they're asking for the name change, I bet they probably did it.
just a little bit of background for now. Rogers built the house, and then the Bagley family owned the house. The only reason it's associated with Daniels is because Josephus Daniels married Addie Bagley, and that's how Daniels family is associated with that. That's the only reason Daniels is on the plaque. Daniels and Addie lived in that house for, I think, a little over 15 years. So, I mean, it's got some Daniels DNA in it, but that's the rough background of the names.
That makes sense. I mean, and so they may say we don't need any of these names, you know, or we need. I mean, I bet they have that data because they wouldn't have voted haphazardly, especially given your history. You know, that they only live there, you know, so they name the house after. You know, I want my name on the front of my door because I live here. I've been here 4 years, so I want mine.
If we need to look into this more, could y'all send us the actual paperwork or whatever from the original? I don't know what's available to you. Or
I can send you the report after, but I think asking for a letter is a good place to start. So I'll reply back to their attorney that, you know, something you're, you know, certainly in, you know, willing to look into, you know, move through the process and ask for a letter from, you know, whoever, whether it's the board or the Shaw, you know, with, you know, making the request with some explanation behind it. And I will bring it next month.
yeah, it seems like owners of any property should be able to at least petition, you know, to have the names changed or altered or added, you know, if they think it's justified, right?
I think if they think it's justified, I think it needs to be very specific, or we're going down, you know, a little bit of a slippery slope. The name. I mean, sometimes, I mean, when a building is significant simply for its architecture, the name is less important. And whether it's, you know, all the families that live there or the last one, or frequently, you know, it's the family that lived there the longest, it'll be named after. It would be different if a building is significant, you know, because of one of the people, you know, or one of the families associated with it, and less about it, in which case you wouldn't want to, you may not want to rename it to be, you know, the most recent family, because really the reason it's a landmark was because of the family at a different time. But yeah, but what's most important is that buildings that have been determined by RHDC and City Council to have special significance are in fact listed as landmarks, not necessarily what they're called. And it does take money. Well, just as a little thing, it does take a little bit of money out of the budget. Each of these plaques is about $650. But you've got money in the budget for plaques right now.
Okay, I have to run. Thank you all. Sorry.
Hi, thank you.
Okay, so moving on. I've been doing a lot of work on the historic potential landmarks list, filling in those missing bits and adding stuff to it. I would really like to get those letters out if possible. And I was wondering, did we plan on sending out letters to every single property, or, like I said in my email, like, should we send it all out, all of them, all the letters out to every single property owner, or pick specific ones? What were we planning on doing this? It's been a while since we've discussed it, but
the last time we talked about it, we were going to send a letter to everyone on the list currently. But in the past, I think it had been maybe 6 to 10 selected every year to send a letter.
We have missed a couple of years though, so.
How many do we have on the list currently?
I think it's like 148, maybe.
it is. I've got 99. Does that sound right?
It may be. I know that I had found a lot of duplicates of things called different names, but the same address. So that might narrow it down to that amount.
Sounds like we need to get one more on there.
So for a staff effort, part of that, what we would really be doing, we would generate the letters, make sure that the addresses got in there. As long as there's not a rush, we do now have administrative help for doing, you know, the stuffing and the mailings. So it certainly something that, you know, an additional thing for staff to do, but I don't think it would be a super heavy lift. We've got, I think we would want to double check and make sure that the letter is still what you want. You edited it. And I think we had a final draft, but we'd want to check that. So honestly, if you're asking, well, what's y'all's opinion, Colette and Aaron, all or apart?
don't really understand what the follow workload might be if we get a lot of interest, but I see no harm in contacting 100 people rather than 10 people, particularly since this is a long process, typically to massage a property owner into feeling comfortable with it. And the only downside I see is if we contact the same property owner every year and they have no interest, and it becomes, a menace. But
That was my worry, and I was sort of leaning toward picking out specific properties that are priorities, rather than just sending out a blast. I think it has more impact if we, especially if we make it known, that this is a priority for us.
Well, so part of the original process, when we contacted someone, if we got a response that was not at this time or, no thanks, it gets noted in the spreadsheet with the date so that, we continue to monitor if the property changes hands or, if enough time has passed, then we would be able to try again. So we wouldn't be contacting everyone every year after this point, I don't think.
Okay.
Also, Tanya, if I remember correctly, a commissioner has to sign each letter. Is that correct? Really, the letters come from individual commissioners.
They do come from individual commissioners. I forgot about that,
Yeah,
that
so
piece.
you would have to sort of talk each of them into saying, all right, you get 15, you get 15, or I assume, because then, they are the signatories of the request.
I mean, that's not set in stone. That is the way y'all have done it in the past. So it feels more personal.
I'm going to vote sending out less rather than more. Anybody else have any opinion on that, either one way or the other?
That seems like what we've done in the years past, seems logical, especially since if we keep following with the commissioner having to sign, so each commissioner is essentially claiming a batch of them, or 1 or 2 or 5, whatever it may be, sending out that many may be a bit more work than some want to do. Not just signing, but I would assume then they would be sort of the contact for those properties as well. So might want to check with those folks first. Also, a little aside, I don't want to get this off on a whole separate thing, but we talk about studies and hiring architectural historians to do this or that. I know that we've had this nice long list of potentials for a long time, and throughout the years that I was involved, 1 or 2 of us would say, all right, I'll take these 10, I'll just go see if they're still there, I'll go see if they are obviously have not been altered beyond recognition, stuff like that, just sort of a check. I wonder if it'd be possible to hire a consultant to do that very job, or maybe it's already been done since I last heard about all this, but the idea of a professional just buzzing by each one of these and saying, yeah, it's still there, and this is who owns it. And anyway, just a thought for future expenditures.
Sort of what I'm doing, Caleb.
Yeah, we had an intern that was helping us that it didn't work real well.
It's a big job, and I don't know that it's just, I can only imagine having to go to each one of these and kind of trying to sort out what's what. Might be worth our while, or worth to have a professional that's a little better at it do it. But maybe that's an unnecessary expense, especially if Ian's working for free, So.
Do you, maybe next month, Ian, you can bring the 10, 8, 10, whatever that you think should be sent, and then you can get them assigned to Katie and Susan to volunteer to be the contacts on them. I'm not sure if I don't think we've used, the non-commissioner volunteers, I don't think we've used y'all in those letters previously, so it would need to be a commissioner.
Okay.
But so staff will bring the letter, make sure that the final copy is, and then y'all can discuss the properties next month.
I will send you, before our meeting next month, I'll send you my updated version. Anyone have anything else? Well, if that's it, then I will see y'all next month.
Thank you.
See y'all.
Bye.